Just as HellRaisers were able to use veteran coaching from Jonta, get their old school player Angel, put him into a new role, have him learn a more tactical style of in-game leading and transform their whole team by finding the right roles for different people and acclimatizing to them to those roles. When you go to Boomeo and you watch the guides there, veterans from France, North America, Brazil, teach you the game, teach you how they think about the game, how they play out their different roles, their role within their team, and help you get a sense for where you should put yourself in the game in order to maximize your talent and go out there and raise a little hell like you could learning on Boomeo and improve at your duels. Get to the level where you're like a Zero who has good aim, but you know how to apply it by playing in the duels mod, playing on the servers, the retake servers, etc. they have over at Boomeo. So HellRaisers are a team where their recent rise, making it, you know, solid top 10 placing in my rankings a couple of times in a row, is something that actually is a very interesting story when you pick it apart. And it shows a team that even though they had 4 of the 5 members in this lineup way back in time, last year in 2016, and even though they had all 5 members as of, I think it was September 2016, the lineup now and how it is succeeding is almost inverted in terms of the success of which players from the team are the leading to their team success, and how the different focus and structure has made them into a legit team. Because the key thing with HellRaisers is you can go back a couple of stages and find a different HellRaisers every time, because everyone really noticed this particular lineup not when they first formed in September when DeadFox joined officially, but actually when they qualified for the major. So that was obviously in December of last year, and they did so beating NIP. They were able to make it to the major, they flopped there, and the big results were coming as a result of DeadFox's performance. So people thought, right, it's all about DeadFox. He's the guy who's going to be the star player. And the key detail is you've got to go further back than that to set the expectations of how HellRaisers themselves were playing and how people thought they were going to play. Because when you go back to 2015, when the real core of this team gets together, Oscar had been a player who joined and had been a key element. Sticko was there. Angel was there. Now, obviously, Angel and Sticko are the 2 players that still remain. But in that old lineup, they had Simple standing in for a while. They'd with the previous lineup, the CIS lineup, before Oscar and Sticko had joined, they'd failed to make it to the major with Simple standing in. Simple left. In came Schneider, and he was the stand-in for a few months. Then they got Zero, who obviously knows Sticko. He came along, another Slovakian player. Kucha left the lineup at this point in time. They had Smike, that Russian player, standing in for a brief time. Zero joined officially. Quest One, another player from that kind of Oscar, Sticko, those kinds of their region, those kind of players came along. Eventually they got Bondic, so now we're starting to get to where they have all the members of the lineup, except they have Oscar instead of DeadFox. And a key detail that went under the radar initially was that in June of last year, Jonta, former player back in the end of 1.6 with players like Angel and someone who has a good amount of experience in Counter-Strike, joined as their director and soon enough took over as the head coach. And then the key thing is, very briefly after that, Oscar left the team. Obviously, it was already known that he was going to go to Mouse Sports. He'd signed a contract months in advance, and so he stepped down. He was still under contract, so they just didn't use him. And eventually, Oscar went to Mouse Sports, and people initially thought, right, this HellRaisers team is dead. Because at that point in time, the team had been carried by Oscar. But then they get DeadFox in about a month or so after Oscar officially joins Mouse Sports, replacing Smike, who'd been standing in. And now from September, middle of September last year onwards to now, we've had the same 5-man lineup. So this lineup has been around for, we're talking like a solid, I mean, let's see. We're coming on like 7-8 months now. So really, if you ever know one of my principles, that is typically 8 or 9 months is the lifespan of most 5-man lineups, and within 3 to 4 months, you tend to usually know what a team's about and how they're going to play. Now, that is where HellRaisers is very interesting, because while we do have a very good sense for who they are now, they changed up halfway through their lifespan entirely how they play and where the focus and where the firepower comes from in their lineup, and that's the key thing. So you go back to 2015, they're putting the pieces together, they're gradually getting together. 2016 is really when you've got like, you know, a solid 4 of the 5 players, 3 of them initially starting out, and you start the first half of the year when they're getting the lineup together, they gradually get Bondic in, they have 4 of the 5 players, At the time, though, Oscar is there rather than DeadFox, and he is the star player of the team. He is beasting online, and every offline tournament they go to, he's having really big performances. He's looking amazing. Along with Oscar, the second best player in terms of firepower is actually the young guy Sticko, a guy who hasn't got tons of experience, but had been playing a while in CSGO, and he's having big lands for the first 2/3 of 2016. He's looking like he's the guy that he's the Robin to Oscar's Batman, but Oscar really has to do a lot to give them a chance, and he even has huge performances in tournaments they don't win, and in matches that they lose against the tier 1, against the high tier 2, and they're mainly just stomping tier 2 and tier 3, and it's looking like it's all on Oscar. Now, when Bondic joins, he's initially good. I mean, he came over from Flipside. He's not as good as he was in Flipside. He doesn't have the blade system around him, but he's decent enough. At the time, though, Angel was way worse than he is now. Angel was a very mediocre player, and in terms of as a leader and a captain, he was just average to below average at best. He didn't have Jonta with him as the coach. He didn't have the tactical element that they brought in later. And Zero, when he joined the team, was the worst player in the team. Offline, he was having really poor performances. He wasn't doing much. He looked lost. He's a player who had aim, so you could see him online do have some crazy rounds and look like, oh, great highlight. And then offline, you saw nothing, and he looked shook. He looked like he was nervous, like he couldn't get into the offline game. And so it really was just the Oscar show with occasional cameos by Sticko most of the time, and then Bondic being decent. The rest of the team, largely a write-off. So understandably, even with Jonta coming in, becoming the coach, when Oscar immediately is leaving to Mouse, and you've lost your main star player who's carrying the team, it's easy to look at the team and say, right, the team's dead, or we've got to find a replacement for Oscar. So they get DeadFox, and he's going to become the Orpra of the team. And at the first tournaments, Epicenter, E-League qualifier for the Major, actually, it's working. Amazingly, DeadFox is coming in and he's being the star player. He's having big fragging performances. He's got consistency to his numbers, and the maps he wins make you look really good. Then Angel's level is improving as well. Suddenly, as the in-game leader and now working a bit more tactical style, he's actually getting his fragging numbers up. Now, bizarrely, it's actually Sticko who drops off at this point in time. Bondic stays around the same, and Zero remains a problem player. He hasn't got it together at all, even as they're getting to the point where they can now qualify for the Major. So they make it to the Major off of the back of DeadFox performances, big performances. We remember the one against NIP, and I think there's one against Mouse Sports on Train, where Mouse Sports bizarrely went into Train, where it was a good map for HellRaisers at the time. And the main thing that's disappointing is, at the Major, they bomb out completely. They go home very, very early, and DeadFox absolutely bombs this LAN and does terrible. So if that was your condition, now DeadFox needs to carry us. It's all about DeadFox wins. You can see why it's easy to look at HellRaisers and go, that's the end. Like, it was a fluke that they made it there. In fact, when you look at the fact they beat Nico Mouse and NIP, those teams didn't look great, obviously, at the time. Nip especially has been on a downhill slide, and so all of a sudden you're thinking, oh, maybe we were a bit too excited about the fact they even could do upsets. And then at the Major, only one player actually played to a good level, and that was Angel. And that kind of was a trend where you could see his trajectory was still going up, even if DeadFox's was coming down again. Now, at the time, this team that made it to the Major and then bombed was in some senses different to this team, but had some aspects that were similar. Their best map at the time, by far, they were specialists on Cobblestone. They could beat Virtus Pro, Heroic, Godsend, teams that play Cobblestone. They lost to SK, but at the time, SK could still play Cobblestone. They were fantastic on Cobblestone. On Train, they were pretty good there. They were only really losing to good Train teams. Optic, they lost to Godsend, who at the time had a little spike in form. They were decent on Overpass. Obviously, they lost to good teams on it. They could win against other good teams, but wouldn't always beat Tier 1. And then beyond that, they had problems on Nuke. Cash was actually kind of weak. Mirage was weak, and they didn't play Dust 2. Now, obviously, Dust 2 got removed. That helped them as a team, and we got this new HellRaisers. So even though it's the same team, going forwards, the reason they've had these results, top 4-star series, I mean, went out in the group stage of DreamHack Austin, but next week come right back, second place DreamHack Tours. The reason for these new results, this is a very different HellRaisers. It's the same 5-man lineup, but the way they have played and where it's come from has been very different. And so the key detail is they've been way more tactically sound. Jonta's input, I've read interviews with Angel where he's been talking about how they've been working on more tactical approach to the game. They're more methodical approach. They're not just playing off individual skill as old HellRaisers lineups before Jonta largely did, particularly Oscar, Dosia, Kutcher, going way back in time. Now they're a team where actually I think the best player in the team right now is Angel. Angel as a fragger is fantastic and is very consistent. He's someone who's good in clutches because of his experience. And he's very calm. And as an in-game leader, he seems to be doing a pretty good job right now. And he's now finally figured out with his personnel how to use them better than the really up and down, hit or miss HellRaisers that they had at the end of 2016, early 2017 when they qualified for the major. Believe it or not, though, outside of Angel, the player who's had the most improvement and has radically turned his game around, the guy who was the worst player in HellRaisers in all of 2016, including when they qualified for the major, was Zero. He has blossomed to the extent that all those tournaments I just cited, where they had good performances and all their big wins, Zero is coming up massive at the level that HellRaisers is at. His performances are the ones giving them their map wins, and there's almost like a perfect correlation between when he does well and when they win maps and they do well in tournaments. So that's an absolute inversion. He went from worst player in the team to one of the best, if not the best, in some senses. So he's really empowered himself in his game. Obviously, he was a young guy, fairly inexperienced guy. Now he's got it on his legs under him, and he seems to be being utilized correctly, and his confidence is there completely. Now, DeadFox actually hasn't gotten up to being a star. He isn't like the player he was when he first joined in September 2016. The thing about DeadFox that's very weird is he's no longer the player where his big performances are the ones that key into your wins, which will sound weird, because obviously the first game of Star Series, that's what happened, right? It was the classic old HellRaisers where DeadFox did well on Cash against FaZe, the eventual champions of the tournament, and they won the opening game. But beyond that, and in all the subsequent tournaments, it hasn't been DeadFox having big performances that gets HellRaisers map wins. He is a very streaky player. He's very inconsistent in terms of having good performances. And the funny thing is, he's not a feast or famine player, because that makes it sound like it's almost like an even split. He's very much a famine player. He's been having a lot of issues, and then he has the occasional big game. But funnily enough, the occasional big game just puts you over the top because of the fact Angel's there all the time, because of the fact Zero's there when you're winning games. DeadFox just becomes the third guy, and he puts you over the top and ensures the win. They've had many games, many maps that they've won against good opposition where DeadFox has played really poorly, not got into the game, but they won the map anyway thanks to Angel and Zero's performance. Bondic has remained a rock. He's still stable. He's still kept doing what he's doing. And actually, Sticko has never really recovered. He did fall off. He's been decent enough, but the idea that he's your worst player, he's lowest on top, he's still a pretty decent enough young player. Someone who, like I said, in 2016, the first 2/3 of the year was having good performances. So that kind of shows that actually the spread in this team's pretty solid. And when you've got some pretty consistent performers in Angel, in Bondic, in Zero now, and then DeadFox is just this luxury player where you don't rely on him to win every game, but if he does well, he'll put you over the top. And then if Sticko's your worst player, well, he's going to have the very occasional good game. And actually, he's a decent enough worst player to have on your team in that respect. Now, interestingly enough, the map pool has changed in some respects, but in other respects stayed the same. The main difference and what's inverted is they went from having Cobblestone as this amazing map for them and Cash as like a not very good map for them to flipping it. Now Cash is their best map, and now Cobblestone is very much out in the wilderness, and admittedly they're mainly losing Cobblestone to the good Cobblestone teams, but that's the problem of playing it. When they play it, they only play good Cobblestone teams, otherwise people avoid them on it. So at the moment, Cash is the map that's doing well for them. The only team to beat them on it recently was G2, and G2's had some monster performances, even though that is an up and down map for G2. But in general, G2 has beaten HellRaisers on every map. Now they've beaten North on that map, they've beaten FaZe on that map. Overpass is still a very strong map. Overpass and Train remain two of their top 3 maps. Overpass, they're smashing everyone on. They're beating the Norths of the world. Train, okay, their loss on it recently was against FaZe, 14-16. And many people would say FaZe is a top 3 Train team in the world right now. So Train is still very solid. The rest of them are still not great, but at least they've got something they can do. Like, they can play a little bit of Mirage. They can definitely play Cobble. It's just the problem is they lose to the good Cobblestone teams. They can't really play Nuke, and they've been pretty terrible on Inferno. So actually, Dust 2 going out hasn't particularly boosted them in any way, even though it was their worst map. They do not play because they haven't figured out Inferno. Luckily, they haven't had to play it very much, so people aren't picking it against them, which is a key detail going forwards as to what can happen with HellRaisers. So really, it's been Cobble and Cash that have flipped, and even that end, the map pool is inverted in terms of best map. So the problem for HellRaisers is the placings sound great. Top 4 Star Series, one of the biggest events of the year. Group stage of DreamHack Austin, not very good, Tier 2 LAN. But then DreamHack Tours, Tier 2 LAN, 2nd place. Okay, that sounds like, hey, those are some good placings. The problem is, you go and look at their wins, not that many are really that legit, though. Like, first of all, very few big series wins. They basically only have one series win of note, which is against North. And North famously have now made a habit of getting upset in playoff series. And that was a very close one. North really could have won that 2-0. Then you've got to add in, they've had lots of single map upsets. But first of all, some of them are on teams that no longer are as good as we thought they were at the time. So the main one's obviously NIP. They've upset NIP a few times, but no one thinks of NIP as good at the moment. They've upset North a few times, and while North still have a lot of potential and still seem to have a good base of players and a decent, they're not the elite team challenging for championships that we thought they were going to be when they were getting these upsets. So the North upsets are legit. They're just not as good as they were. Now, the most legit upset, obviously, is over FaZe. But that's it. I mean, you're running dry on best of one upsets at that point in time. So they've got one best of 3 upset. They've got a couple of best of 1 upsets that are really legit. And they've had a few dodgy losses. Like, if they really were ready to join that sort of top 7, top 8, top 6 teams in the world, having losses to Gambit and Heroic a couple of times, that's not really going to cut it, you know. Those aren't teams that necessarily are in any way challenging to be elite level teams. So the big problem for HellRaisers right now is where they are right now looks good. And it looks, when you chart it, like they're on an upward trajectory. But I feel like actually they've done well to get here. It's legit to get here. But actually they're going to stay here, if not go a little bit down. And the reason why I say that is I expect them to be an 8th to 10th place team going forwards for the next few months. Because the big problem is, they've been around with this lineup 7-8 months, like I said. There's not going to be much more development. If anything, they've gotten a massive amount of development that most teams don't get out of their lineup and changed a lot. Now, on paper, they have solid enough map draws versus most teams because they always want to ban Nuke if they can, occasionally train if it's a really strong opponent, but in general, they'll play it. They're banning Nuke mainly, and they're trying to pick Cash mainly. They want to get rid of, essentially, Nuke and Inferno. Those are the 2 maps they don't want to have to play. So they need to avoid Nuke and Inferno when they play opponents, especially in series. And then Mirage just depends on the opponent. Apparently, no one's the best on Mirage at the moment, so I can forgive them for that. So really, they want to play Cash, Overpass, Train, and they want to avoid Nuke and Inferno. The problem with that is, actually, on paper, they can match up and play against almost everyone in the top teams. So G2 on paper looks like a good team to play against, right? They'll play you on Cash. I mean, admittedly, they're going to pick Cobble into you, which is going to be tough, and you might end up with an Overpass or Train or whatever, and you'll have your chances there, but the problem is G2 has just spanked HellRaisers every time they play them, so that's almost irrelevant how the matchup on paper goes in terms of the maps. Astralis would seem okay, because Astralis are willing to play all of their maps. The big problem is, Astralis still probably better on Cash. Astralis can pick Nuke or Inferno, depending on which you ban, so immediately you're at a disadvantage, and they can win on your maps, Overpass and Train. So that's going to be too tough there. North is a solid enough matchup as we've seen. That's actually already been the case already. They're willing to play those maps. But North, on paper, should still be better than you ultimately. But you'll have your shots for an upset there. Virtus Pro's not terrible. The problem there is, like, obviously, you can ban out Nuke, and they're not exactly going to pick Inferno. But when they go to maps like Train, they're going to be pretty good. So against Virtus Pro, you might have some good upset chances if you can get it to Cash or Overpass. You can do something there. Mirage and Train, it's going to be a bit questionable. VP will probably break you there. SK is actually not that terrible because SK doesn't want to play Nuke either. So they're not going to be playing that. Problem is, SK is very good on Cobble at the moment, so that's real tough for you right there. SK are amazing on Mirage right now. SK's Cash has improved leaps and bounds, and they can still occasionally play Train and Overpass. So maybe if you get Train and Overpass, you have a shot there. FaZe is way too tough. Like, they're good at all your maps, basically. And obviously, you have to ban out Nuke against them. There's nothing you can do there, and they've improved a lot on Inferno. FaZe is way too tough for them. Immortals is a nice enough matchup, actually. That's a team where you could see them being able to get wins, because Immortals are willing to play Cash. You can beat them on that. Train, Overpass, those are maps that Immortals do not want to play you on. Overpass, they have to have huge Henny performances. Mirage, we obviously know that's based on Henny. And Nuke is still not something that the Immortals have ever been good on, even if they've played it a lot. Na'Vi's actually a good matchup, because Na'Vi themselves need to get away from Nuke. They can't play it properly, but then again, they've got the issue with Cash, so really it comes down to Overpass and Train, and unfortunately, that's just on the firepower of Na'Vi. You live or die by when their firepower turns on these 2 maps. Gambit is a bad matchup, actually, even though Gambit's worse than a lot of these teams I've mentioned, because Gambit, when you ban Nuke, because they're playing it now, and have been decent on it now, Gambit bans Cash themselves, so there's your best map out, and then Gambit is going to pick Cobble against you, and they love Cobble. And then Overpass, that's right in Gambit's wheelhouse too. So Gambit is a bad matchup. It's one of the worst ones, actually. So I think, really, you look at this lineup here, realistically, the only teams you're going to beat if you're Hellraisers or had a chance to in a series is Immortals when Henny's not going off, North, if they just keep underwhelming as they do. I mean, maybe you could have a shot against VP, but beyond that, you've got to win Cash. They've probably got to do well on Overpass. It's going to be real tough to get any series wins. So I don't see them picking up more big series wins, except if they play Immortals. I don't see them going any higher. And I still see them being a team that gets upsets on some teams on the right maps and just loses to the other top teams. And so actually staying about 8th to 10th seems reasonable. And if at any point in time, Nip, Fnatic, these teams start to rise again, Heroic, now, unfortunately, you're meeting teams that could actually play better than you and outplace you. So Hellraisers, props to them for figuring this out, for inverting a lot of their factors and becoming good and adapting from when they'd been figured out completely as this cobblestone-only team. But at this point in time, I don't see how they go much further.
Welcome, everybody. Blessed are those that visit this channel and enjoy the content here.